This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this exploration of one of the world's most complex and dynamic regions. Today, we'll journey through the intricate web of relationships that define the Persian Gulf states, a region where ancient histories meet modern ambitions, where shared cultural threads intertwine with deep rivalries, and where questions of identity shape the balance of power. From competing visions of regional leadership to the fault lines of sectarian difference, we'll uncover how these nations navigate cooperation and conflict in their pursuit of influence and security. Join us as we unravel the forces driving both unity and division across these pivotal waters. Chapter 1: Centuries of Conquest and Conversion. The roots of the Persian-Arab rivalry stretch back far beyond the modern nation-state, reaching into the very foundations of Islamic civilization and the imperial competitions that preceded it. Long before Saudi Arabia and Iran emerged as regional powers in the 20th century, the peoples living on opposite shores of the Gulf viewed each other through lenses colored by conquest, resistance, and cultural superiority. These ancient perceptions have not faded with time. Instead, they have been carefully preserved, selectively remembered, and transmitted across generations to shape how Iranians and Arabs understand their relationship today. The split that would define much of this rivalry began in the year 632, shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The question facing the nascent Muslim community was deceptively simple: who should succeed him as leader? One group believed the leader should be chosen through consultation among the Prophet's companions, supporting Abu Bakr, a friend and early follower of Muhammad. This group would become known as the Sunnis, from the Arabic word sunnah, meaning tradition. Another group insisted that leadership must remain within the Prophet's family, supporting Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. These followers of Ali became known as the Shia, from Shiat Ali, or Party of Ali. What began as a political disagreement over succession evolved over centuries into religious, cultural, and ethnic divisions that would shape the geography of power in the Middle East. The split became violent and permanent following the Battle of Karbala in 680, where Hussein ibn Ali, the son of Ali and grandson of Muhammad, was killed alongside many of his supporters by the army of Caliph Yazid. For Shia Muslims, particularly in what would become Iraq and Iran, this massacre became a defining tragedy, commemorated annually in rituals of mourning that reinforced their separate identity. The cities of Najaf and Karbala in Iraq, home to the tombs of Ali and Hussein, became sacred pilgrimage sites that would anchor Shia identity in the heart of Mesopotamia for over a millennium. The ethnic dimension of this rivalry emerged alongside the religious one. The early Islamic conquests of the 7th century saw Arab armies sweep across the Persian Sasanian Empire, defeating a civilization that had dominated the region for 4 centuries. The Sasanian Empire, with its magnificent capital at Ctesiphon, its fire temples, its sophisticated administrative systems, and its literary traditions preserving ancient Zoroastrian texts, represented one of antiquity's great civilizations. The royal court patronized poets and scholars, maintained elaborate irrigation networks that made Mesopotamia fertile, and controlled trade routes linking China to the Mediterranean. When Arab armies destroyed this empire between 633 and 651, they did not merely conquer territory, they shattered a world. For Persians, the Arab conquest represented not just military defeat but cultural humiliation. The sophisticated Sasanian court fell to what many Persians viewed as culturally inferior desert tribes. Warriors who had defended the empire for generations were killed or enslaved. The Zoroastrian religion that had defined Persian identity for 1,000 years was gradually displaced by Islam brought by the conquerors. Persian became subordinate to Arabic as the language of religion, administration, and high culture. This sense of civilizational superiority, the belief that Persian culture was more refined, more ancient, and more worthy than Arab culture, became deeply embedded in Persian identity and would shape Persian responses to Arab political dominance for centuries. The response to this humiliation took the form of the Shu'ubiyya movement in the 9th and 10th centuries, when Persian Muslims pushed back against the growing Arabization of Islam. Shu'ubiyya intellectuals championed Persian culture and language, asserting that Persians had built great empires and civilizations when Arabs were still nomadic tribesmen. The movement produced poets and scholars who celebrated pre-Islamic Persian kings and questioned the Arab monopoly on Islamic interpretation and leadership. The great Persian poet Ferdowsi epitomized this resistance in his epic Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, completed around 1010. This massive poem, comprising some 50,000 couplets, celebrated pre-Islamic Persian kings and heroes as symbols of national glory. Ferdowsi deliberately composed his masterwork in Persian rather than Arabic, preserving and elevating the Persian language at a time when Arabic dominated high culture. The Shahnameh recounted the deeds of legendary Persian heroes like Rostam, the victories of kings like Cyrus and Darius, and the cosmic battles between good and evil that shaped Persian mythology. For many Iranians across subsequent centuries, this narrative of cultural resilience against Arab domination became a source of pride and a justification for maintaining distance from Arab neighbors. The tribal dynamics of the Arabian Peninsula and southern Iraq added another layer of complexity to these tensions. Arab tribes living along the western shore of the Gulf maintained fluid relationships with Persian authorities across the water, sometimes submitting to Persian overlords, sometimes raiding Persian territories, and sometimes serving as intermediaries in trade networks that connected India to the Mediterranean. The Bani Tamim, one of the largest Arab tribes, had branches that extended into Khuzestan in southwestern Persia, creating kinship networks that crossed what would later become rigid national borders. These connections did not necessarily create loyalty or affection. Persian officials often viewed Arab tribesmen as unruly, unreliable, and prone to banditry, while Arab tribes resented Persian attempts to tax and control their movements. The transformation of Iran into a Shia state under the Safavid dynasty beginning in 1501 fundamentally altered the regional balance and gave the Persian-Arab rivalry a sharper religious edge. Shah Ismail I, the dynasty's founder, did not merely adopt Shia Islam as the state religion. He enforced it violently, systematically persecuting Sunni Muslims and executing those who refused to convert. Sunni scholars were killed or driven into exile. Sunni mosques were destroyed or converted to Shia use. The Safavids imported Shia scholars from Lebanon and Bahrain to staff religious institutions because Iran lacked sufficient Shia clerical infrastructure. This forced conversion created the Shia majority that exists in Iran today, but it also positioned Iran in direct ideological opposition to the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Sunni tribes of the Arabian Peninsula to the south. The Iranian national identity that emerged from this period fused Persian ethnicity with Shia religious identity, creating a double distinction from the Arab Sunni populations across the Gulf. To be Iranian became synonymous with being both Persian and Shia, a formulation that marginalized the Sunni Kurds, Baluch, and Arabs living within Iran's borders, but created a powerful sense of distinctiveness from Arab neighbors. The Ottoman-Safavid rivalry played out with particular intensity in Iraq, which became a battleground between the two empires for over 2 centuries. For the Ottoman Turks, who subscribed to the Hanafi school of Sunni jurisprudence, control over Baghdad, the former seat of the Abbasid Caliphate and home to the shrine of Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanafi legal school, represented religious legitimacy and connection to Islam's golden age. For the Safavids, sovereignty over the shrine cities of Najaf, Karbala, Qadamiyya, and Samarra, where the most important Shia imams are buried, was essential to their claim of defending Shia Islam against Sunni persecution. This rivalry plunged Iraq into recurrent warfare. The Safavids captured Baghdad in 1508 and again in 1623, holding it for 15 years before Ottoman forces reconquered the city in 1638. Each conquest brought religious persecution. Sunnis suffered when Safavids held power, Shias when Ottomans ruled. The Safavids destroyed the shrine of Abu Hanifa in Baghdad. The Ottomans restricted access to Shia holy sites. Iraqi populations learned to navigate between these powers, developing survival strategies of outward conformity while maintaining private beliefs, and cultivating connections to whichever power seemed ascendant at any moment. The mass conversion of Iraqi Arab tribes from Sunni to Shia Islam in the 18th and 19th centuries further complicated these dynamics. The Bani Malik, originally a Sunni tribe settled in southern Iraq, converted to Shi'ism in the 1700s under the influence of Shia religious scholars from Najaf. The Bani Lam, another major Arab tribe, similarly embraced Shia Islam during this period. These conversions occurred through multiple mechanisms: intermarriage with Shia families, economic ties to Shia shrine cities, intellectual persuasion by Shia scholars, and sometimes the pragmatic calculation that conversion would provide protection from Ottoman persecution. These conversions created an Iraqi Shia identity that was Arab rather than Persian in ethnicity, but shared religious orientation with Iran. The Ottoman state, however, refused to accept this distinction. Ottoman law legally treated Iraqi Shias as potential Persian subjects, denying them full citizenship rights and maintaining surveillance over their communities as security threats. This Ottoman practice of viewing Shia populations through an imperial security lens rather than as citizens with rights established patterns that would persist in the modern Iraqi state and contribute to sectarian tensions long after the Ottoman Empire's collapse. The emergence of modern nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries grafted new ideologies onto these ancient divisions. Persian nationalists, many educated in Europe and exposed to European concepts of the nation-state, began emphasizing Iran's pre-Islamic heritage, the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, as sources of national pride distinct from and superior to Arab Islamic civilization. The Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great and Darius had stretched from Egypt to India, building the first universal empire that connected diverse peoples through roads, postal systems, and administrative innovations that would influence governance for centuries. Intellectuals like Fethali Akhundzada argued that the Arab conquest had been a disaster for Persian civilization, imposing an alien religion and alphabet that corrupted the purity of Persian culture. This narrative portrayed Islam itself as an Arab colonial imposition, though most Persian nationalists stopped short of rejecting the religion entirely and instead emphasized Iran's distinct Shia tradition as proof that Persians had shaped Islam rather than simply submitting to it. The adoption of the Persian solar calendar rather than the Islamic lunar calendar, the celebration of Nowruz as the primary national festival, and the emphasis on pre-Islamic Persian heroes in education and public monuments all reflected this nationalist project of distinguishing Persian identity from Arab Islam. Arab nationalists developed their own competing narrative as the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Arab intellectuals sought to define an Arab nation. These thinkers emphasized the Arabs' role in creating and spreading Islam as proof of Arab cultural and historical significance. The idea that Arabs had conquered and converted the Persians became a source of pride, evidence that Arab civilization had triumphed over the ancient empires of the region. This narrative ignored or minimized the substantial Persian contributions to Islamic civilization, in philosophy through thinkers like Avicenna and Suhrawardi, in science through astronomers and mathematicians, in literature through poets like Rumi and Hafez, and in Sufi mysticism that shaped Islamic spirituality. Instead, it portrayed Persians as perpetual outsiders, non-Arabs who could never truly belong to the Islamic heartland that Arabs had created. The British and other European colonial powers exploited and reinforced these divisions during their period of dominance in the Gulf. British administrators in Iraq systematically favored Sunni Arabs for positions in the military and bureaucracy during the Mandate period, after World War I, constructing a state apparatus that marginalized the Shia majority. This policy reflected British calculations that Sunnis would be more reliable allies because they lacked connections to Shia Iran. But it created a pattern of Sunni political dominance over a Shia majority that would destabilize Iraq for the next century. British treaties with Gulf Arab sheikdoms similarly drew boundaries and established hierarchies that served British commercial and strategic interests while disregarding tribal territories and historical relationships. These ancient patterns, the Sunni-Shia split crystallized at Karbala, the Persian memory of Arab conquest and determination to preserve distinct identity, the Safavid creation of Shia Iran in opposition to Sunni neighbors, the Ottoman-Persian competition over Iraq, the tribal conversions that created Arab Shia communities, and the rise of ethnic nationalisms claiming superiority over the other, all persisted as the modern states of the region emerged in the 20th century. When Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi took power in Iran in 1941 and consolidated control after the 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, he inherited and deployed these historical narratives. The Shah emphasized Persian imperial greatness, celebrating the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire at Persepolis in 1971 with a pageant that invoked Cyrus and Darius, while ignoring Islam entirely. His vision of Iranian greatness focused on pre-Islamic civilization and modern development, not religious identity. For Arab rulers in the Gulf, the Shah represented a partner they could work with, despite these historical tensions. His nationalism was secular rather than sectarian, and his government maintained the monarchy as a system of rule that Gulf Arab monarchies recognized and respected. The Shah made no effort to export Iranian ideology or challenge the legitimacy of Arab governments, focusing instead on building Iran as a regional power aligned with the West. This created space for cooperation despite mutual prejudices that persisted beneath official diplomacy. Yet this accommodation rested on foundations that centuries of rivalry had made unstable, and the ancient patterns of conflict between Persians and Arabs, between Shias and Sunnis, remained powerful forces ready to reshape the Gulf's future. Chapter 2: The 1979 Revolution and Iraq-Iran War, when Shah's partnership with Arab monarchies became Khomeini's revolutionary threat and Saddam's 8-year battlefield. On a cold February morning in 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi boarded a plane in Tehran, leaving Iran for what would become permanent exile. Within days, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from his own exile in Paris to a rapturous welcome from millions of Iranians. This transfer of power did not merely change governments in Tehran, it detonated a political earthquake that would reshape the entire Persian Gulf, transforming what had been one of the United States' most reliable allies into a revolutionary state dedicated to overthrowing the very monarchies that Iran had once partnered with. The Shah's Iran had been the cornerstone of regional stability for the Gulf Arab states. Khomeini's Iran would become their nightmare. For nearly 4 decades, the Shah had positioned Iran as a modernizing secular state aligned with the West and friendly with conservative Arab monarchies. American presidents from Eisenhower through Carter viewed Iran and Saudi Arabia as the twin pillars of Persian Gulf security, 2 pro-Western states that could be armed and empowered to maintain regional order without requiring permanent American military presence. The Shah and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, despite their different systems of government, shared fundamental interests: opposing communism, containing Arab radicalism, and protecting the Gulf's oil wealth. When leftist movements threatened Oman's Sultan Qaboos in the Dhofar Rebellion during the early 1970s, the Shah sent Iranian troops to help crush the insurgency. When Saudi Arabia worried about the rise of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, the Shah offered reassurance that Iranian military power would balance any threat from Baghdad. This partnership rested on mutual recognition of sovereignty and a shared commitment to the status quo. The Shah made no serious effort to export Iranian ideology to Arab states, nor did he challenge the legitimacy of monarchical rule. His vision of Iranian greatness focused on economic development, military power, and international prestige, not religious revolution. The lavish celebration he hosted in 1971 at Persepolis to commemorate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy epitomized this approach. It was a display of nationalist pride rooted in pre-Islamic Persian civilization, not an Islamic rallying cry. Gulf Arab rulers could work with this version of Iran because it threatened neither their thrones nor their societies. Khomeini's revolution obliterated this comfortable arrangement. The elderly cleric who seized power in Tehran brought with him a radically different vision, one that explicitly challenged the legitimacy of monarchical rule throughout the Gulf. Khomeini's doctrine of vilayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, held that only rule by Islamic scholars properly trained in Shia jurisprudence could be legitimate. By this logic, the hereditary monarchies of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE were not merely un-Islamic. They were illegitimate usurpers of authority that rightfully belonged to the clergy. Worse still, these monarchies collaborated with Western powers, particularly the United States, which Khomeini called the Great Satan, making them not just illegitimate, but treasonous to Islam itself. The revolutionary rhetoric pouring from Tehran in 1979 and 1980 made the threat explicit. Khomeini and his lieutenants spoke openly of exporting the revolution beyond Iran's borders. "We shall export our revolution to the whole world," Khomeini declared. Until the cry, "There is no God but God," resounds over the whole world, there will be struggle. Iranian officials called the ruling families of the Gulf many shahs and puppets of imperialism. State-controlled radio broadcasts in Arabic urged the oppressed masses of the Arabian Peninsula to rise up against their rulers. These were not abstract ideological statements. They were calls to action directed at populations across the Gulf, and they terrified the monarchs who heard them. The sectarian dimension of this threat made it particularly potent in states with significant Shia populations. Bahrain, where Shias constitute roughly 60 to 70% of the population, but political power rests with the Sunni al-Khalifa ruling family, seemed especially vulnerable. Kuwait's Shia minority, perhaps 30% of the citizen population, represented another potential fifth column. Saudi Arabia's eastern province, home to most of the kingdom's oil wealth, had a substantial Shia population that had long faced discrimination and marginalization. If these Shia communities could be mobilized by Iranian revolutionary ideology, the entire regional order might collapse from within. The fear was not purely hypothetical. In November 1979, just months after Khomeini's triumph in Tehran, Shia communities in Saudi Arabia's Qatif region erupted in protest. The immediate trigger was the annual Ashura commemorations, public mourning rituals for the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, that the Saudi state had long prohibited. Emboldened by the Iranian Revolution and inspired by Khomeini's example, Shia residents of Qatif decided to hold public Ashura processions despite the ban. Saudi security forces opened fire on the marchers, killing at least 20 people and wounding many more. The violence spread over several days, with demonstrations and clashes continuing through the month. The Organization of Islamic Revolution in the Arabian Peninsula, a group with connections to Iran, played a role in organizing and sustaining these protests. The group operated a radio station from Iran and maintained an office in Tehran, broadcasting revolutionary messages into Saudi Arabia and providing organizational support to Saudi Shia activists. Saudi authorities viewed this as proof of Iranian interference, evidence that Tehran was actively working to destabilize the kingdom from within. The Qatif uprising convinced Saudi rulers that Khomeini's threats were not empty rhetoric, but an operational campaign to overthrow their government. Across the narrow waters of the Gulf, Bahrain's Sunni monarchy watched these events with mounting alarm. Bahrain had its own history of Shia political activism, and the Iranian Revolution energized opposition movements that had been suppressed for years. Making matters worse, Iran had never formally renounced its historical claim to sovereignty over Bahrain. As recently as 1968, before agreeing to recognize Bahraini independence, the Shah's government had insisted that Bahrain was rightfully part of Iran. Now, with a revolutionary government in Tehran explicitly committed to overthrowing Gulf monarchies, Bahraini rulers feared that Iran might revive these territorial claims while simultaneously encouraging Bahraini Shias to rebel. The ruling Al-Khalifa family saw themselves squeezed between an external Iranian threat and an internal Shia majority whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. Iranian revolutionary agents did indeed work to cultivate Shia opposition movements in Bahrain and Kuwait. In Bahrain, the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, founded in 1981, was explicitly inspired by the Iranian Revolution and allegedly received support from Tehran. The group's leadership came from Bahraini Shias who had studied in Iraq's Shia seminaries and absorbed revolutionary ideology. In December 1981, Bahraini security forces claimed to have uncovered a plot by this group to overthrow the government, allegedly with Iranian backing. Whether the plot was as serious as the Bahraini government claimed or exaggerated for political purposes remains disputed, but the incident reinforced the perception that Iran was actively working to destabilize Bahrain. Kuwait experienced similar pressures. A series of bombings in Kuwait in the early 1980s, including attacks on the American and French embassies and oil installations, were attributed to groups with Iranian connections. Kuwaiti Shias, who had previously coexisted relatively peacefully with the Sunni majority and ruling family, now came under suspicion as potential Iranian agents. This suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Some Kuwaiti Shias did support the Iranian Revolution and saw Khomeini as a heroic figure standing up to Western imperialism and Arab authoritarianism. But the vast majority of Kuwaiti Shias maintained their primary loyalty to Kuwait, resented being treated as a fifth column, and had no desire to see their country become part of an Iranian empire. For Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, the Iranian Revolution presented both threat and opportunity. As an Arab nationalist who had built his power base in Iraq's Ba'ath Party, Saddam viewed Khomeini's Islamic revolutionary ideology with deep suspicion. The Iraqi Ba'ath regime was officially secular, and Saddam's inner circle consisted overwhelmingly of Sunni Arabs from his hometown of Tikrit. But Iraq's population was roughly 60% Shia, and many of Iraq's most prominent Shia religious leaders maintained close connections to Iran's clerical establishment. If Khomeini could inspire Iraq's Shia majority to rebel, Saddam's regime might face the same fate as the Shah's. Khomeini gave Saddam every reason to worry. The Ayatollah explicitly called for the Iraqi people to overthrow the Ba'athist government, referring to Saddam as an infidel and a tyrant. Iran's revolutionary radio broadcasts in Arabic targeted Iraq with particular intensity, urging Iraqi Shias to rise up against their oppressors. The Iranian regime hosted Iraqi Shia opposition figures, including Mohammad Bakr al-Sadr, a prominent cleric and political thinker who advocated Islamic government in Iraq along lines similar to Iran's system. When Saddam's security forces arrested and executed al-Sadr and his sister in April 1980, the Iranian government erupted in fury, with Khomeini calling for revenge and the overthrow of the Iraqi regime. But Saddam also saw opportunity in Iran's revolutionary chaos. The Shah's military, once the most powerful in the Gulf, had been gutted by revolutionary purges. Thousands of officers trained in the United States had been dismissed, imprisoned, or executed as suspected royalist sympathizers. Equipment procurement had halted, spare parts were scarce, and morale was low. Meanwhile, Iran's Arab-majority province of Khuzestan, just across the border from Iraq, appeared ripe for liberation. The province held most of Iran's oil infrastructure, and its Arab population had a history of tension with the Persian-dominated central government in Tehran. Saddam convinced himself that a quick military strike could seize Khuzestan, cripple Iran's oil production, destroy the revolutionary regime's economic base, and perhaps trigger the collapse of Khomeini's government entirely. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces invaded Iran, launching what would become one of the 20th century's longest and bloodiest wars. Saddam expected a quick victory, perhaps a few weeks or months of fighting before Iran sued for peace. Instead, the war would drag on for 8 years, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and devastating both countries' economies. Saddam's miscalculation stemmed partly from believing his own propaganda about Iranian weakness and Arab superiority, and partly from misreading the revolutionary fervor that would mobilize Iranians to defend their country despite their grievances against the regime. The initial Iraqi advances did capture territory in Khuzestan, including the city of Khorramshahr, after brutal urban combat. But the anticipated uprising by Khuzestan's Arab population never materialized. Despite decades of discrimination and cultural suppression by Tehran, most Iranian Arabs proved more loyal to Iran than to the idea of Arab liberation promised by Iraq. This loyalty reflected several factors. Many Iranian Arabs were Shia and therefore had little affection for Saddam's Sunni-dominated regime. The Iranian Revolution had initially promised greater rights and autonomy to ethnic minorities. And Iranian national identity, for all its Persian chauvinism, had deeper roots than Arab nationalism in Khuzestan. Iraqi propaganda portraying the invasion as Arab liberation from Persian occupation fell flat when Iranian Arabs experienced Iraqi occupation as foreign conquest. By mid-1982, Iran had not only expelled Iraqi forces from its territory, but had gone on the offensive, invading Iraq itself. Iranian leaders declared that they would not stop until they had toppled Saddam's regime and liberated the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala. This Iranian offensive terrified the Gulf Arab monarchies. A victorious Iran that had conquered Iraq would be an unstoppable revolutionary force, positioned to threaten Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the smaller Gulf states directly. The nightmare scenario of Iranian-backed Shia revolutions spread across the Gulf no longer seemed far-fetched but imminent. The Gulf monarchies responded by pouring resources into Iraq's war effort. Saudi Arabia alone provided tens of billions of dollars in financial assistance to Baghdad, effectively subsidizing Iraq's ability to continue fighting. Kuwait, despite its unease about Saddam and its own Shia minorities' divided loyalties, shipped oil on Iraq's behalf to generate revenue, since Iraq's own oil export facilities were largely blocked by the war. The UAE provided financial support and allowed Iraq to use Emirati ports and airports. Even small Qatar contributed funds. This collective Gulf Arab support for Iraq transformed what had begun as an Iraqi invasion of Iran into a regional war, pitting Arab states against the Persian revolutionary upstart. The United States, still bitter from the 1979 to 1981 hostage crisis, in which Iranian revolutionaries held American diplomats captive for 444 days, also tilted toward Iraq. Washington provided Baghdad with intelligence, including satellite imagery of Iranian troop positions, and removed Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism to facilitate arms sales. American naval forces in the Gulf protected Kuwaiti oil tankers from Iranian attack, effectively entering the war on Iraq's side. From the Iranian perspective, this American support for Iraq proved that Khomeini had been right all along. The United States and its Arab puppet regimes were united in trying to destroy the Islamic Revolution. Iranian propaganda during the war emphasized these themes relentlessly. State media portrayed the conflict not as an Iran-Iraq war, but as Islam versus arrogance, revolution versus imperialism, the oppressed versus the oppressors. Iraqi soldiers were depicted as mercenaries of America and Saudi Arabia, fighting for money and power rather than faith. In contrast, Iranian soldiers and the waves of young Basij volunteers who threw themselves into combat were portrayed as martyrs following in the footsteps of Imam Hussein, willing to sacrifice their lives to defend Islam and the revolution. This narrative resonated powerfully in Iran, sustaining popular support for the war even as casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Iraqi propaganda took a mirror image approach, framing the war as Arabs defending themselves against Persian imperialism and Shia heresy. Saddam's regime emphasized Arab ethnic identity over Islamic unity, portraying Iranians as historical enemies of the Arabs who had invaded and occupied Arab lands for centuries. State-controlled media in Iraq referred to Iranians using derogatory ethnic slurs and portrayed the war as a continuation of the ancient battles between Arabs and Persians. This Arab nationalist rhetoric aimed to rally Iraqi Sunni Arabs to the war effort, but it created problems with Iraq's Shia Arab majority, who were being asked to fight fellow Shias in defense of a regime that marginalized them. Many Iraqi Shias did fight loyally for Iraq despite sharing religious beliefs with their Iranian enemies. This loyalty stemmed from multiple sources: Iraqi national identity, which had been cultivated since the 1920s, Arab ethnic identity, which distinguished Iraqi Shias from Persian Iranians, personal ties to the Iraqi army and government, and, in many cases, distrust of Iranian intentions and fear of Iranian domination. But some Iraqi Shias defected to Iran or actively supported the Iranian war effort, forming opposition groups like the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Dawa Party, which received Iranian backing and maintained forces alongside the Iranian military. These defections, even though they represented a small minority of Iraqi Shias, confirmed the worst fears of Iraq's Sunni leadership and of the Gulf Arab monarchies, that sectarian identity could trump national loyalty and that Iran could potentially mobilize Shia populations across the region. The 1987 Mecca incident demonstrated how the war's tensions could explode even in Islam's holiest city. During the annual Hajj pilgrimage, Iranian pilgrims held a political demonstration in Mecca, chanting anti-American and anti-Saudi slogans and carrying portraits of Khomeini. Saudi security forces moved to suppress the demonstration, and in the ensuing chaos, more than 400 people died, including 275 Iranian pilgrims. The incident has been disputed ever since. Iranians claim Saudi forces deliberately massacred peaceful protesters, while Saudi authorities insist that the Iranians rioted and that the deaths resulted from stampedes in the panicked crowds. Whatever the truth of what happened on the ground, the political consequences were clear. Khomeini denounced Saudi Arabia in the harshest terms, calling the Saudi royal family vile and ungodly, declaring them like daggers which have always pierced the heart of Muslims from the back, and calling for their overthrow. Iran severed diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, and for years afterward, Iranian pilgrims used the Hajj as a platform for anti-Saudi demonstrations, turning the pilgrimage into another front in the broader conflict. For ordinary Iranians and Arabs, the war reinforced and deepened ethnic stereotypes and prejudices. Iranians saw confirmation of their long-standing belief that Arabs were barbaric, treacherous, and inferior. The use of chemical weapons by Iraqi forces, thousands of Iranian soldiers and civilians were killed or injured by mustard gas and nerve agents, was presented in Iranian media as evidence of Arab cruelty and moral bankruptcy. Iranian schoolchildren were taught that Arabs had always been enemies of Iran, from the 7th century conquest through the present war. This anti-Arab sentiment permeated Iranian society, appearing in jokes, in everyday language, in intellectual discourse, and in government propaganda. Not all Arabs were lumped together. Iranian propaganda distinguished between the oppressive Arab regimes and the oppressed Arab masses who supposedly supported Iran, but the general message was clear: the Arab world represented threat and backwardness. Among Gulf Arabs, the war strengthened the perception of Iran as an existential threat driven by both Persian imperialism and Shia fanaticism. The waves of young Iranian volunteers who attacked Iraqi positions in human wave assaults, sometimes clearing minefields by walking across them to their deaths, were portrayed in Arab media as evidence of Iranian fanaticism and disregard for human life. The Iranian use of child soldiers, teenagers as young as 12 or 13 who volunteered for the Basij militia and died in combat, horrified Arab observers who saw it as proof of the revolution's inhuman cruelty. Iraqi propaganda and Arab media more broadly depicted Iranians as a people brainwashed by religious extremism, willing to sacrifice their children for the insane ambitions of turbaned clerics.
The smaller Gulf states navigated this landscape with varying degrees of success and anxiety. Qatar, geographically small and militarily weak, contributed financially to Iraq while maintaining quiet economic ties with Iran, including the massive shared North Dome/South Pars gas field that neither country could afford to militarize. Omani Sultan Qaboos maintained his careful neutrality, allowing both Iranian and Iraqi ships to use Omani ports and serving as a back channel for communications between the belligerents. This neutrality sometimes drew criticism from other Arab states, but Oman's control of the southern shore of the Strait of Hormuz alongside Iran made antagonizing Tehran potentially disastrous. Kuwait found itself in the most exposed position. Its long border with Iraq made it vulnerable to Iraqi pressure, while its coastline faced Iran across the narrow waters of the northern Gulf. Iranian forces actually seized 2 Kuwaiti islands briefly in 1986, and Iranian attacks on Kuwaiti tankers carrying Iraqi oil threatened Kuwait's economy. When Kuwait asked both the United States and Soviet Union to reflag Kuwaiti tankers to provide them protection, both agreed, turning Kuwaiti commercial shipping into an international crisis that nearly triggered direct U.S.-Iran military conflict.
Bahrain's ruling family used the war to further marginalize and surveil its Shia majority population. Any expression of sympathy for Iran or criticism of the war effort could be treated as treason, and Bahraini Shia activists were imprisoned on charges of being Iranian agents. This repression created a self-fulfilling prophecy, as some Bahraini Shias who had initially been loyal to Bahrain became radicalized by their government's treatment and did turn to Iran for support. The Bahraini government's dependence on Saudi military support to maintain internal control became a permanent feature of Bahraini politics, with Saudi forces effectively guaranteeing the Al Khalifa family's survival in power. When the war finally ended in August 1988, it concluded without resolution. Iran accepted a UN ceasefire after 8 years of fighting, but both countries claimed the other had started the war, and both maintained that they had prevailed. Saddam Hussein declared victory and portrayed Iraq as the defender of the Arab world against Persian aggression. Khomeini, who had insisted for years that Iran would accept nothing less than the overthrow of Saddam's regime, bitterly described accepting the ceasefire as drinking poison. Nearly 1 million people had died, mostly young men from working-class and rural backgrounds in both countries. Cities along the border region lay in ruins. Both economies were devastated, with Iraq owing more than $80 billion to Gulf states and foreign creditors. And the fundamental conflicts that had triggered the war remained unresolved. Iranian revolutionary ideology still rejected the legitimacy of Gulf monarchies, and those monarchies still viewed Iran as an existential threat.
But if the war ended without resolution on the battlefield, it left a transformed political landscape. The Iranian Revolution and the war it provoked had shattered the old Gulf security architecture built on the twin pillars of Iran and Saudi Arabia. In its place emerged a new regional order defined by mutual hostility, sectarian mobilization, and military buildup on all sides. The Gulf Cooperation Council, formed by 6 Arab monarchies in 1981 as the war raged, represented an attempt to create collective security without Iran and, increasingly, against Iran. Iranian influence had been contained by the war but not eliminated, and Tehran's determination to challenge Arab and American dominance in the Gulf had only been strengthened by 8 years of conflict and isolation. Would this containment hold, or would new conflicts emerge from the unstable order that the war had created? Chapter 3: Identity as Political Weapon. In April 2005, the Iranian government did something that might have seemed trivial to outsiders, but carried profound weight within the region. It declared April 30th as National Persian Gulf Day. The date commemorated the 1622 expulsion of Portuguese forces from the island of Hormuz by Persian and English forces, but the real purpose had nothing to do with 17th-century naval battles. The Islamic Republic was drawing a line in the sand over what it called the systematic attempt by Arab states to erase Iranian history by promoting the term Arabian Gulf instead of Persian Gulf. Every year since, the Iranian government has marked this day with academic conferences, military exercises near the Strait of Hormuz, and media campaigns hammering home a single message. The body of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula has been called the Persian Gulf for over 2,000 years, and any attempt to change that name represents cultural genocide. For Iran's leaders, both under the Shah and later under the Islamic Republic, the naming dispute transcends mere cartography. It embodies everything they believe about their relationship with Arab neighbors. That Arabs harbor historical resentment over Persia's ancient greatness. That Arab nationalism seeks to diminish and contain Iranian influence. And that Gulf Arab states act as proxies for Western powers trying to dominate the region. When the United Arab Emirates issues a postage stamp showing the waterway labeled Arabian Gulf, Iran responds with its own stamps asserting Persian Gulf. Arab television broadcasters use Arabian Gulf. Iranian state media launches campaigns denouncing this usage. The UN website uses Persian Gulf in official documents, but includes Arabian Gulf in transcripts when Arab delegates speak it. The UK government's Permanent Committee on Geographical Names officially endorses Persian Gulf as standard British usage, which Iranian officials cite as vindication. The intensity of Iranian reaction reveals how deeply Persian nationalism has been woven into the fabric of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy. Paradoxically, the revolutionary government that overthrew the Shah's regime and rejected his secular nationalism has preserved and even amplified his insistence on Persian identity. Ayatollah Khomeini himself, despite his pan-Islamic revolutionary rhetoric, never wavered on the Persian Gulf name. The regime may have rejected the Shah's celebration of pre-Islamic Persian emperors as un-Islamic, but it embraced the underlying assertion of Persia's civilizational superiority over Arabs. This creates a curious duality in Iranian identity discourse. The Islamic Republic officially defines itself through Shia Islam and opposition to Western imperialism, not through ethnic Persian nationalism. Yet in practice, the regime constantly reinforces Persian ethnic identity in ways that exclude non-Persian Iranians, Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluch, who together make up nearly half the country's population. Iranian state media and education systematically cultivates anti-Arab sentiment alongside this Persian nationalism. Textbooks describe Arab invaders as primitive, violent, and culturally backward compared to the sophisticated Sasanian Empire they destroyed. The Arab conquest appears as a catastrophe that temporarily interrupted Persian civilization's natural dominance. Popular culture reinforces these stereotypes. Arabs appear in Iranian jokes as foolish, treacherous, and greedy. The Iran-Iraq War intensified these attitudes exponentially, with Iranian media depicting Iraqi forces and their Arab backers as barbarians attacking civilians. Veterans of that war pass these memories and hatreds to their children, creating generational transmission of anti-Arab sentiment. Yet this Iranian anti-Arab discourse contains an important contradiction. While denigrating Arabs as culturally inferior, Iranian leaders simultaneously claim leadership of the Arab world's Shia populations. The Islamic Republic presents itself as the protector of Shia communities in Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, and beyond, communities that are overwhelmingly Arab. This requires rhetorical balance. Arabs as a whole are backward and hostile, but Arab Shias are brothers in faith who deserve Iranian support against their Sunni oppressors. From the Arab side of the Gulf, the identity weapon functions differently but with equal force. Saudi Arabia's ruling family and clerical establishment frame their opposition to Iran primarily through sectarian religious identity rather than ethnic terms. Following the Iranian Revolution, Saudi Arabia dramatically escalated its promotion of Wahhabi ideology globally, spending billions to build mosques and madrasas from Indonesia to West Africa that taught Wahhabi doctrines and often explicitly condemned Shia practices as polytheistic. This was deliberate strategy to counter Iranian revolutionary influence by mobilizing Sunni identity against Shia identity. Saudi funding flowed to Sunni religious scholars who issued fatwas declaring Shias to be apostates whose blood could be lawfully shed. The sectarian language deployed by Saudi leaders grew increasingly harsh. The Iranian supreme leader called Saudi leaders worthless, incompetent, and mean, and dairy cows of the United States, adding, "They will surely witness destruction, downfall, disaster, and decline." Saudi Arabia responded in kind, with state-linked media and clerics portraying Iran as a Safavid Persian empire using Shia religion as cover for ethnic expansionism. This framing allowed Saudi Arabia to position itself as defending both Sunni Islam and Arab identity against Persian aggression.
Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran has been marked by recurring diplomatic ruptures and inflammatory rhetoric. Young Saudis grew up learning that Iran wanted to dominate Saudi Arabia, control Mecca and Medina, and spread Shi'ism throughout the Arabian Peninsula. The substantial Shia minority within Saudi Arabia's eastern province became objects of suspicion, viewed by many Sunni Saudis as potential Iranian fifth columnists regardless of their actual loyalty. When protests erupted in Qatif, many Saudis immediately assumed Iranian orchestration, unable to imagine that Saudi Shias might have legitimate grievances unrelated to Tehran. The United Arab Emirates employed similar sectarian rhetoric but added another dimension, portraying Iran as the sponsor of Islamist movements that threatened Gulf monarchies. Emirati leaders placed Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, and later Turkey and Qatar in the same category of existential threats. This framing allowed the UAE to justify its opposition to Iran while also cracking down on domestic Islamist movements that might criticize the ruling family's policies.
Iraq's position in this identity warfare reveals both the power and limits of sectarian mobilization. The career of Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani illustrates this complexity. Sistani, though Iranian-born and educated, has lived in Najaf for decades and commands enormous religious authority among Iraqi Shias. Yet Sistani has carefully maintained distance from Iranian political interference in Iraq, issuing fatwas that support Iraqi nationalism and state sovereignty. When the Islamic State threatened Baghdad in 2014, Sistani's call for Iraqis to defend their country mobilized thousands of volunteers not through sectarian appeals, but through Iraqi patriotic identity. This demonstrated that Iraqi Shia identity could be mobilized without serving Iranian interests, a fact that frustrates both Tehran and the Gulf monarchies. Still, Iranian influence over Iraqi politics has grown substantially since 2003, operating through political parties, militias, and economic penetration. Many Iraqis, including Shia Iraqis, deeply resented this Iranian presence, seeing it not as brotherly Shia solidarity, but as Persian imperialism exploiting Iraq's weakness. Bahrain's ruling Al Khalifa family, Sunni Arabs governing a majority Shia population, depends entirely on Saudi military support to survive in power. When protests erupted in Bahrain in 2011, calling for political reform and equal rights for Shias, the government immediately blamed Iran, arrested protest leaders as Iranian agents, and invited Saudi troops to help crush the demonstrations. The overwhelming majority of Bahraini Shia protesters had no connection to Iran and were motivated by domestic grievances: discrimination in employment, underrepresentation in government, and police brutality. But the Bahraini government's survival strategy required portraying any Shia political activism as Iranian subversion, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, as some Bahraini Shias, radicalized by repression, did turn to Iran for support. In June 2017, twin terrorist attacks struck Tehran's parliament building and the shrine of Ayatollah Khomeini. Iranian officials immediately blamed Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies for supporting the attackers, using the incident to reinforce narratives about Saudi-sponsored terrorism and sectarian warfare against Iran. The attacks, along with the broader pattern of accusations and counter-accusations, demonstrated how genuine security threats became entangled with propaganda warfare. Kuwait manages these pressures through studied ambiguity. Kuwait's Shia minority has integrated into Kuwaiti society with less discrimination than in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, though Kuwait still maintains careful balancing between providing some Shia representation and preventing sectarian polarization. Qatar's relationship with Iran demonstrates how economic interests can override sectarian identity politics, though this Qatari pragmatism drew Saudi and UAE accusations of Qatari disloyalty. Oman's Ibadi Islam, neither Sunni nor Shia, allows it to position itself above the sectarian fray, though Sultan Qaboos's successors face pressure to abandon this neutrality. Tribal identities complicate these national and sectarian narratives in ways that official propaganda cannot fully control. The boundaries drawn by colonial powers cut across tribal territories and kinship networks that had existed for centuries. Within Saudi Arabia's eastern province, some tribal leaders maintain quiet contacts with relatives in Iraq and Iran, relationships that the Saudi state views with suspicion. Bahrain's Shia population includes tribal groups with historical grievances against the ruling family dating back centuries. The Dawasir tribe, which is Sunni, has privileged positions in Bahraini security forces precisely because the Al Khalifa family trusts them more than Shia citizens. These internal Shia divisions based on tribal identity prevent unified opposition to Bahraini government policies, a fact the ruling family actively cultivates by distributing patronage along tribal lines. The digital age has accelerated and democratized this identity warfare. Iranian activists on Facebook and Twitter police use of Persian Gulf versus Arabian Gulf, attacking anyone who uses the wrong term. Saudi social media users spread conspiracy theories about Iranian interference in Arab countries. Emirati influencers promote anti-Qatar hashtags. These battles play out in real time across borders, with ordinary citizens becoming foot soldiers in identity wars their governments initiated. A single tweet using Arabian Gulf can trigger thousands of angry Iranian responses. A YouTube video critical of Saudi Arabia's human rights record brings accusations of Iranian propaganda. The boundaries between state-directed campaigns and genuine popular sentiment blur, creating ecosystems of mutual hatred that no government fully controls. The instrumentalization of identity, whether ethnic, sectarian, or tribal, serves leaders' immediate political needs but creates long-term problems that may prove impossible to solve. When Saudi Arabia and Iran mobilize populations using sectarian rhetoric, when they fund religious schools and media outlets that teach citizens to view the other as enemies of true Islam, when they reward loyalty and punish dissent by questioning people's religious authenticity, they build structures of hatred that outlast any individual policy dispute. A Saudi teenager who grows up learning that Shias are heretics, an Iranian child taught that Arabs are backward and treacherous, a Bahraini Shia who experiences discrimination rationalized as protecting Sunni dominance. These individuals carry those lessons into adulthood, creating constituencies that demand confrontation rather than compromise. Can leaders who have spent decades weaponizing identity suddenly ask their populations to make peace with enemies they have been taught to despise? When Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed denounce Iran as the root of all regional instability, when Iranian officials describe Arab regimes as puppets of imperialism, when clerics on both sides issue religious rulings declaring the other side's believers to be apostates, these are not positions that can be easily walked back. They have become core to how regimes justify their rule and how populations understand their place in the world. The identity warfare has created its own momentum, with digital mobilization and popular participation making it harder for leaders to reverse course even if they wanted to. As these poisonous narratives take deeper root in a new generation raised on mutual hatred, the question becomes whether the region's future will be determined by leaders' strategic calculations or by the constituencies those leaders have created, constituencies that may now demand more confrontation than their creators intended. Chapter 4: Smaller Rivalries Within the Gulf. On a humid summer evening in Doha in 1986, Qatari border guards arrested a group of Bahraini fishermen who had crossed into waters Qatar claimed as its own near the Hawar Islands. Within hours, Bahrain's government was accusing Qatar of kidnapping its citizens. Within days, armed Bahraini forces had seized several Qatari nationals in retaliation. The dispute escalated to the point where both countries mobilized military units and international mediators rushed to prevent actual combat. To outsiders, the spectacle of Qatar and Bahrain threatening war over barren islands might have seemed absurd. Both countries combined have fewer people than metropolitan Houston. But to Qataris and Bahrainis, the crisis represented everything they believed about each other. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait mediated the immediate crisis, securing the release of detained nationals and military withdrawals. But the underlying territorial dispute remained unresolved, festering for another 15 years. The rivalry had deep historical roots in the Al Khalifa family's 18th century migration from Qatar to Bahrain and subsequent territorial claims. What mattered in the modern era was how these ancient grievances shaped contemporary attitudes. Bahrainis viewed Qataris as nouveau-riche upstarts using oil wealth to buy respect they had not earned through history or culture. The Al Thani were merely fortunate Bedouin who struck gas, not sophisticated rulers like the Al Khalifa. Qataris returned this contempt, seeing Bahrain as a has-been clinging to past glories while economically dependent on Saudi handouts and politically subservient to Riyadh. The personal relationship between Qatar's emir Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani and Bahrain's king Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa amplified these tensions. Hamad bin Khalifa, who seized power in a bloodless 1995 coup, founded Al Jazeera in 1996 with editorial freedom that allowed it to criticize Arab governments, including, pointedly, Bahrain's monarchy. Bahraini officials viewed this as Qatari psychological warfare, using media to destabilize Bahrain. When Al Jazeera gave airtime to Bahraini activists, the government saw Qatari fingerprints on programming designed to pressure Manama. Qatar's position was that Al Jazeera practiced real journalism unlike state-controlled Gulf broadcasters. If Bahrain's government could not handle truthful reporting, that reflected Bahrain's problems, not Qatar's malice. When Qatar won rights to host the 2022 FIFA World Cup, Bahraini social media erupted with accusations of bribery and predictions that Qatar's lack of civilization would be exposed. The Hawar Islands dispute finally reached the International Court of Justice in 2001. The ruling awarded most of the Hawar Islands to Bahrain, but gave Qatar sovereignty over Zubarah and some smaller disputed areas. Both countries claimed victory. Bahrain emphasized the Hawar Islands decision. Qatar highlighted its Zubarah victory.
The legal resolution removed one flashpoint but left the underlying mutual resentment intact. Neither population accepted the court's division as fair, viewing it as a compromise that satisfied neither side's legitimate claims. Kuwait's position within Gulf politics has always been defined by geography's curse. Squeezed between Iraq to the north and Saudi Arabia to the south, with Iran across the Gulf waters, Kuwait cannot afford to fully antagonize any larger power, but it also cannot rely entirely on any single protector. This creates a foreign policy of cautious balancing that other Gulf states view with varying degrees of suspicion or understanding. Saudi Arabia historically treated Kuwait with a mix of protection and pressure. During the 1990-1991 Iraqi occupation, Saudi Arabia hosted the Kuwaiti government in exile and provided territory for coalition forces to liberate Kuwait. This created a debt that Saudi rulers have called in when wanting Kuwaiti support. Yet Kuwait has resisted becoming a Saudi satellite. Kuwaiti parliamentarians have criticized Saudi policies more openly than would be tolerated in other Gulf monarchies, and Kuwait maintained diplomatic relations with Iran even during periods of high Saudi-Iranian tension. This independence irritates Riyadh but falls short of Qatar's level of defiance, so Saudi Arabia tolerates it. The UAE views Kuwait's balancing act with less patience. Mohammed bin Zayed operates from a worldview that divides states into friends and enemies, with little room for neutrality. Kuwait's approach of seeking compromise rather than confrontation represents exactly the kind of fence-sitting that Abu Dhabi finds dangerous. Kuwaiti citizens generally view their Emirati neighbors as arrogant, having forgotten their own humble origins. Before oil, the Trucial states were even poorer and less significant than Kuwait, which at least had a thriving port and merchant class. That Abu Dhabi now presumes to lecture Kuwait on foreign policy strikes many Kuwaitis as ridiculous. Emiratis, in turn, view Kuwaitis as complacent and weak, content to let Parliament endlessly debate rather than take decisive action. The Kuwaiti National Assembly, the Gulf's most empowered elected legislature, represents to Emiratis exactly the kind of messy democratic politics that bin Zayed has worked to prevent. Kuwait's Shia minority, roughly 30% of citizens, complicates its regional positioning. Unlike Bahrain, where the Shia majority faces systematic discrimination, or Saudi Arabia, where Shias are marginalized, Kuwait has allowed its Shia citizens substantial political participation. Kuwaiti Shias serve in parliament, hold government positions, and participate in business with fewer restrictions than their counterparts in neighboring states. This relative integration reflects deliberate statecraft by the Al-Sabah ruling family, which has worked to prevent sectarian polarization. The 1990 Iraqi invasion demonstrated Kuwaiti national unity across sectarian lines. Kuwaiti Shias and Sunnis both resisted the occupation. This experience convinced Kuwait's rulers that inclusive policies served national security better than discrimination. Oman stands furthest from the sectarian battlefield and most distant from Saudi influence, creating friction with both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Sultan Qaboos bin Said, who ruled from 1970 until 2020, built Omani foreign policy on strict neutrality and independence. Oman maintained diplomatic relations with Iran throughout decades when Saudi Arabia and the UAE treated Iran as an enemy. Most significantly, Oman facilitated secret talks between Iran and the United States that led to the 2015 nuclear agreement. These negotiations, held in Muscat beginning in 2013, remained hidden from other Gulf states until they were well advanced. When Saudi Arabia and the UAE learned that Oman had hosted Iranian-American talks without informing them, they saw it as betrayal of Gulf solidarity. The UAE's Mohammed bin Zayed viewed Oman's Iran policy as dangerously naive or willfully enabling Iranian expansion. Emirati officials privately complained that Sultan Qaboos cared more about maintaining his role as regional mediator than confronting Iranian threats. Omanis viewed Emirati criticism with disdain.
Oman's history as a unified state stretched back centuries, while the UAE was an artificial 1971 construction cobbling together 7 emirates. Oman had survived through careful diplomacy and avoiding unnecessary conflicts, while the UAE involved itself in every regional crisis from Yemen to Libya, achieving little except destruction. Ordinary Omanis spoke of Emiratis as reckless children playing with guns, willing to fight to the last drop of someone else's blood. Omani Ibadi Islam created additional distance from Gulf neighbors. Ibadism represents a distinct branch of Islam that is neither Sunni nor Shia, allowing Oman to position itself above sectarian conflicts. Ibadi theology emphasizes piety and correct behavior over sectarian identity, and Ibadi legal traditions differ substantially from both Sunni and Shia jurisprudence. An Omani ruler citing Ibadi principles to justify neutrality between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran has religious cover that a Sunni leader attempting the same neutrality would not. Iraq and Iran loom over these intra-Gulf rivalries as external forces that smaller states must account for but cannot control. Iraq's weakness since 2003 has made it an arena where Gulf states compete for influence. Qatar invested in Iraqi reconstruction and maintains ties with various Iraqi political factions. Kuwait's relationship with Iraq remains colored by the trauma of invasion. Kuwaitis have not forgotten, and Iraqi promises to respect Kuwaiti sovereignty ring hollow to people who remember Iraqi tanks rolling through Kuwait City. Saudi Arabia and the UAE view Iraq as a country that must be prevented from becoming an Iranian satellite, but their ability to shape Iraqi politics has proven limited. Iran's role varies by which Gulf state you ask. For Qatar, Iran represents an economic partner and potential counterweight to Saudi pressure. The massive North Dome/South Pars gas field that Qatar shares with Iran creates mutual interests that transcend sectarian differences. Oman views Iran as a neighbor that must be engaged rather than confronted. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supplies pass, is controlled by Iranian and Omani shores. Any military conflict would potentially close this strait, devastating the global economy and turning Omani territory into a battlefield. Sultan Qaboos calculated that maintaining dialogue with Iran served Omani interests far better than joining Saudi-led campaigns to isolate Tehran. His successor, Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, has continued this approach despite pressure from Washington and Riyadh. Kuwait's view of Iran balances threat perception with pragmatic engagement. Kuwait has maintained diplomatic relations and trade with Iran while coordinating security policy with Saudi Arabia and hosting American forces. This balancing act satisfies no one completely, but serves Kuwait's goal of avoiding becoming a battlefield. The tribal dimensions that cut across state rivalries create a complex subterranean layer that official nationalism tries to suppress but cannot eliminate. Bedouin tribes like the Aniza, Mutair, and Ajman have branches across multiple Gulf states, creating kinship networks that predate modern borders. A Mutair tribesman in Kuwait may have cousins in Saudi Arabia's northern region, creating family loyalties that complicate purely national identity. Kuwait's tribes play significant roles in parliamentary politics, with tribal leaders commanding blocks of votes based on kinship rather than ideology. Bahrain's tribal politics operate along sectarian lines that reinforce the Sunni-Shia divide. The Dawasir tribe, which is Sunni, has privileged positions in Bahraini security forces precisely because the Al Khalifa ruling family trusts them more than Shia citizens. Within Bahrain's Shia majority, different tribal groups maintain distinct identities. The Baharna, Shia Arabs indigenous to Bahrain, see themselves as distinct from Ajam, Shia of Iranian heritage, and from Shia tribes that migrated from Arabia. These internal divisions have prevented unified opposition to government policies, a fragmentation the ruling family actively encourages through patronage distributed along tribal lines. Qatar's massive wealth has weakened traditional tribal structures more than in other Gulf states. The Al Thani ruling family comes from the Bani Tamim tribe. But Qatar's citizen population is so small and wealthy that tribal identity has less political salience than in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. Qatari citizens, regardless of tribal background, enjoy substantial state benefits and have less need to rely on tribal networks. This relative weakness of tribal politics has allowed Qatar's leadership more freedom to pursue assertive foreign policies without worrying about tribal constituencies constraining their choices. Oman's tribal structure differs from the Arabian Peninsula's Bedouin pattern. Omani tribes include both coastal groups with seafaring traditions and interior mountain tribes with warrior histories. The Hinawi and Ghafiri tribal confederations that dominated Omani politics for centuries have largely been superseded by modern state institutions, but tribal identity remains significant in local politics. Sultan Qaboos successfully subordinated tribal leaders to state authority by incorporating them into government structures while ensuring regional development projects distributed benefits across tribal territories.
As Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed reshape the Gulf's power structure through their rivalry, these smaller states face increasingly difficult choices. Kuwait's parliamentary system constrains its ability to align completely with either Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. Oman's succession from Qaboos to Haytham raises questions about whether the new sultan can maintain neutrality against mounting pressure to choose sides. Can any of these smaller powers preserve the independence they prize? Or will the intensifying competition between larger neighbors force them into alignments that compromise their sovereignty?
Chapter 5. Rival Visions, Personal Grudges. As the world focused on the unprecedented Arab blockade of Qatar in June 2017, few noticed the power struggle between the two leaders orchestrating it. Mohammed bin Salman, freshly elevated to Saudi crown prince after sidelining dozens of rivals in a Ritz-Carlton purge, saw the Qatar operation as demonstrating Saudi leadership of the Gulf. Mohammed bin Zayed, who had spent decades methodically building the UAE's military and intelligence capabilities, viewed the same blockade as proof that Abu Dhabi's strategic vision should guide regional policy. Both wanted recognition as the dominant force shaping the Gulf's future. Both resented the other's assumption of primacy. Their partnership masked a deeper competition between two ambitious leaders pursuing overlapping but conflicting visions of Gulf order. Mohammed bin Salman's November 2017 detention of dozens of princes and businessmen in Riyadh's Ritz-Carlton sent an unmistakable message. He would tolerate no challenges to his authority. The arrests, widely viewed as shakedowns to extract wealth and enforce loyalty, shattered the careful system of royal consensus that had governed Saudi succession since the state's founding. MBS had not inherited power through established protocols. He seized it through systematic elimination of rivals.
Vision 2030 became his signature project and foundation for claiming leadership. The program promised to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy away from oil, develop tourism and entertainment sectors, and empower women in the workforce. For young Saudis, particularly in Riyadh and Jeddah, MBS represented liberation from religious restrictions. The lifting of the ban on women driving, opening of cinemas, and permitting of concerts materially improved daily life. Saudi youth posted celebratory videos attending movie theaters and music festivals, activities that would have brought religious police harassment years earlier. But modernization came with brutal repression. Women's rights activists, including Lujain al-Haflul, who had campaigned for years to drive, were arrested weeks before the driving ban lifted. The message was clear. Changes came from MBS's will, not civil society pressure. The 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul demonstrated the lengths to which the Crown Prince would go to silence critics. For Saudis who opposed MBS, speaking out became literally dangerous. Vision 2030's economic promises have proven harder to deliver than social changes. The Saudi economy grew 8.7% in 2022, but the IMF projected a slowdown to just 1.9% in 2023, the steepest downgrade among major economies. Private sector growth continues lagging, and non-oil government revenue targets remain unmet.
The Yemen intervention MBS launched in 2015 became an embarrassing quagmire. Kuwait's rulers, watching Saudi forces struggle against Houthi rebels, privately questioned whether MBS understood military realities or was driven by ego.
Mohammed bin Zayed's path to power followed a different trajectory but led to similar concentration of authority. As Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and de facto UAE ruler, MBZ spent decades building capabilities that made the UAE far more powerful than its small size suggested. He invested in special operations forces trained by former American and British officers, developed sophisticated intelligence apparatus with advanced surveillance technology, and cultivated relationships with military strongmen from Libya to Yemen. Unlike MBS's dramatic purges, MBZ accumulated power gradually and methodically. MBZ's worldview divides the world into existential threats and useful partners, with little room for neutrality. He sees political Islam, any movement using Islamic ideology to challenge existing governments, as existential danger to Gulf monarchies. This category includes not only Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but also the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey under Erdogan and Qatar, both supporting Brotherhood-aligned movements, therefore represent threats equal to Iran. This framing justified UAE involvement in conflicts from backing military strongman Khalifa Haftar in Libya to supporting Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's authoritarian government in Egypt against Islamist opposition. For Emiratis, MBZ represents competent authoritarianism, delivering prosperity and stability. The UAE's economic success, glittering cities, and position as global business hub are credited to MBZ's strategic vision. Emirati citizens enjoy substantial state benefits and living standards, making the UAE the envy of the region. That this prosperity comes with zero political freedom and pervasive surveillance does not bother most Emiratis, who view economic opportunity as more valuable than political participation.
But non-Emirati residents experience MBZ's system differently. Hundreds of thousands of South Asian laborers building Dubai's skyscrapers live in conditions approaching indentured servitude, with passports confiscated and wages unpaid. Political dissidents from across the Arab world who thought they found safe haven in Dubai have been arrested and deported to face torture in their home countries. The personal rivalry between MBS and MBZ initially remained hidden behind diplomatic courtesy, but has emerged increasingly into the open. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia and UAE initially coordinated their intervention, but over time their proxies came into conflict, with Emirati-backed separatists in southern Yemen fighting Saudi-backed government forces. When UAE forces largely withdrew in 2019, leaving Saudi Arabia bearing the burden of a failing war, it demonstrated MBZ's calculation that Yemen was becoming a Saudi quagmire not worth Emirati resources. Economic rivalry has grown particularly intense as both pursue similar diversification strategies, putting them in direct competition. MBS has not hidden his desire to redirect business from Dubai to Riyadh, reportedly telling foreign executives that companies must base regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia or lose market access. The UAE's response has been accelerating its own reforms and leveraging first-mover advantage in aviation, logistics, and finance. Emiratis speak dismissively of Saudi attempts to replicate Dubai's success, suggesting Saudi Arabia lacks the competence and openness that made the UAE successful.
Both leaders view Iran's theocratic leadership with contempt laced with grudging respect. They deploy the sectarian and nationalist frameworks explored in Chapter 3, framing opposition through Saudi nationalism and defense of Sunni Islam against what they portray as Persian imperialism hiding behind Shia religion. Yet Iran has survived sanctions, isolation, and military pressure, while maintaining regional influence through proxy forces. A staying power that frustrates the Gulf monarchs who expected economic pressure would force revolutionary ideology's abandonment.
The January 2, 2016 execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimrar, a prominent Shia cleric, followed by attacks on the Saudi embassy in Tehran the same day with 40 arrests, exemplified how these tensions explode. Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir called Iran the single most belligerent actor in the region. The 2015 Mina stampede during Hajj, which killed hundreds, including many Iranians, sparked Iranian accusations of Saudi negligence targeting Shia pilgrims. These incidents fed narrative cycles where each side portrayed the other as irredeemably hostile. From Tehran's perspective, MBS and MBZ represent everything wrong with the Arab world. Corrupt autocrats ruling through family connections, squandering oil wealth on weapons and vanity projects, collaborating with Israel and the United States against fellow Muslims. Iranian state media regularly mocks both leaders, emphasizing their youth and inexperience compared to Iran's seasoned leadership. When MBS launched the Yemen war, Iranian officials predicted it would become his Vietnam, a prediction Iranian propaganda has not let Saudis forget. The Khashoggi murder gave Iranian propaganda endless material for depicting MBS as a bloodthirsty tyrant.
Iranian leaders particularly enjoy highlighting contradictions in Saudi and Emirati positions. How can Saudi Arabia claim to defend Islam while normalizing relations with Israel and imprisoning Islamic scholars who criticize the government? How can the UAE present itself as a modern, tolerant society while bombing Yemeni civilians and operating secret prisons where detainees are tortured? Yet Iranian leaders also recognize that MBS and MBZ have proven more formidable opponents than initially expected. The Saudi-UAE-Israel coordination against Iran, formalized through the 2020 Abraham Accords and intelligence sharing, represents strategic alignment Iran cannot ignore. Iraqi leaders occupy the most precarious position, navigating between Iranian influence permeating Iraqi politics and Arab Gulf states viewing Iraq as a prize to be contested. Former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who served from 2014 to 2017, exemplified this balancing act. During the fight against ISIS, Iraq needed Iranian military support through Qasem Soleimani and the Popular Mobilization Forces. But Abadi also sought American military assistance and tried maintaining sovereignty by preventing the PMF from operating entirely independently of Baghdad's control. After ISIS's territorial defeat, Abadi attempted building relationships with Saudi Arabia, hosting Saudi officials in Baghdad for the first time in decades, and seeking Saudi investment in reconstruction. Such balancing becomes nearly impossible when Iranian and Arab Gulf interests directly conflict. When Saudi Arabia demanded Iraq distance itself from Iran and join Arab League condemnations of Iranian policies, Iraqi leaders faced impossible choices. Fully complying would invite Iranian retaliation and domestic backlash from Iraqi Shia parties aligned with Iran. Refusing would confirm Gulf suspicions that Iraq was permanently in Iran's orbit. Iraqi leaders typically chose ambiguous middle positions, offering rhetorical support for Arab solidarity while maintaining practical Iranian relationships, satisfying no one but avoiding worst outcomes. The 2019 protests erupting in Baghdad and southern Iraqi cities targeted the entire political class, but Iranian influence drew particular fury. Protesters burned down Iranian consulates and offices of Iranian-backed political parties, chanting Iran out alongside demands for jobs and services. Yet these same protesters rejected Gulf Arab narratives portraying all Iraqi Shias as Iranian proxies. They insisted on Iraqi national identity transcending sectarian divisions, demanding Iraq be governed for Iraqis' benefit rather than as an arena for regional power competition. Tribal dynamics continue shaping how these rivalries play out on the ground. MBS's consolidation required managing Saudi Arabia's powerful tribal constituencies, particularly tribes like the Anisa, Mutayr, and Shamar in interior regions historically holding significant influence. His strategy combined co-optation, providing benefits to tribal leaders who supported him, with intimidation of those who might resist.
The 2017 arrests included members of prominent families with tribal connections, demonstrating that traditional tribal status would not protect anyone who challenged MBS. MBZ faces different tribal dynamics in the UAE, where tribes remain politically significant but less powerful than in Saudi Arabia due to the UAE's smaller citizen population and massive expatriate majority. Emirati tribes like the Bani Yas Confederation receive patronage and privileged positions, but they understand that MBZ's power ultimately rests on state institutions rather than tribal legitimacy. In Iraq, tribal politics operates with Byzantine complexity. Sunni Arab tribes in Anbar and western regions often supported anti-government insurgencies when feeling excluded from Shia-dominated governments. Shia tribes in the south compete among themselves for government positions and resources. Iranian influence flows partly through religious networks and Shia parties, but also through relationships with specific tribal leaders who can mobilize support. Saudi and UAE attempts to counter Iranian influence often involve cultivating relationships with Sunni tribal leaders, and some Shia tribes resenting Iranian dominance, offering money and political support in exchange for opposing Iranian proxies.
Smaller Gulf states watch the MBS-MBZ competition with mounting anxiety. The 2017 blockade of Qatar, which both championed, ended in 2021 without Qatar meeting their demands, demonstrating limits of Saudi-Emirati coercion. Kuwait's leadership has observed how MBS and MBZ accumulate personal power and drawn conclusions about what Kuwait should avoid. Kuwaiti observers note that power concentration in single individuals creates instability because succession becomes uncertain and policy continuity depends on one person's health and judgment. Oman faces mounting pressure from both the Saudi-Emirati axis and Iran to abandon its traditional neutrality. Bahrain's ruling family has placed itself entirely within the Saudi-Emirati camp, with King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa personally close to both MBS and MBZ, depending on Saudi military protection against Bahrain's Shia majority. Whether these personal projects can overcome structural forces pulling the region toward continued instability, or whether the rivalry between these strongmen will itself become another driver preventing the Gulf from achieving the prosperity both leaders claim as their ultimate goals, remains unclear. As a new generation grows up shaped by the nationalist narratives these leaders have cultivated, can any reversal toward regional cooperation still be imagined?
The Persian Gulf's rivalries run far deeper than current headlines suggest. Centuries of conquest, religious schism, ethnic prejudice, and tribal loyalties have created wounds that modern leaders exploit rather than heal. When Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed mobilize populations using sectarian rhetoric, when Iran positions itself as defender of oppressed Shias while denigrating Arabs, when every dispute becomes interpreted through ancient grievances, they construct barriers to peace that may outlast their own rule. The region's smaller states navigate these tensions with varying success, but all face mounting pressure to choose sides in conflicts that serve neither their interests nor their people's welfare. The question facing the Gulf is not whether these rivalries have deep roots. They do. It's whether future generations will inherit the wisdom to transcend them or only the hatred to perpetuate them. Thank you for listening.